Hello, this lesson takes you through the unseen extract called or entitled The Winslow Boy, and is in response to the mock exam that you would have done. In this video, I'm going to do a model introduction, and then begin to launch into the extract as well. Let's share the screen and get cracking. There is the question. Explore the significance of elements of political and social protest writing in this extract. What we don't want to do is just tick off elements. Therefore, what we do want to do is identify the meaning of the extract and what it's all about. In the first sort of online digital lesson that I did on this, we came up with, or I highlighted to you, the following three sort of big ideas, and it's ever so neat to look at, isn't it? Terence Rattigan appears to be highlighting something to do with gender roles, maybe something to do with the patriarchy. Many of you will have identified that in your piece of writing. But then I think there are perhaps even more interesting things to be said about these ideas here, and I think these two combine quite nicely. Does the individual matter more than the state? Is it right that the needs, the requirements of one person, the Winslow Boy, take on a kind of national prominence? Does it matter? Or does the big state, does the organisation of government at large need to focus on things much more important than, you know, a sole individual? And then a third thing is whether the crime actually matters, or whether it's the principle of it altogether. So I'm not going to read the extract because we have done that bit, and you can see that it's all there. I will just draw your attention, however, to this phrase here, the ways, because in addition to writing about the elements of protest and the meanings of that, we have to consider the methods, the ways in which the author shapes meaning. First, before we get to that stage, let's do an introduction. And my introduction wants to make reference to each of these points here. It wants to make reference to patriarchy, gender roles, and what you can now see on the screen. So I'm keeping that to the side so that I constantly make reference to it. I need to keep my introduction reasonably concise, but I want to put the writer's name front and center because he has written the text to protest about something. There is an agenda, there is a problem, there's some beef, and that beef needs to be articulated early on. So I'm pausing there just to break it down, otherwise you really are just watching me write something out. While Rattigan evidently does raise the issue of gendered roles in Edwardian society, perhaps the more interesting protest is, so look, what I'm doing is I'm beginning with the word while so that I can acknowledge that it's happening, but there's, I think, something else happening. Gendered roles, I make reference to Edwardian society because it is Edwardian society. It's post-World War I. So maybe if I were to go back and add to this, I would say, I would add that. While Rattigan evidently raises the issue of gendered roles in pre-World War I Edwardian society, perhaps the more interesting protest is, so I'm already setting up that I think, well, it's there, this idea of patriarchy, perhaps, But I think there's something more significant going on. I'm implying my feelings. My opinion is present. It's just in the passive voice. Perhaps the more interesting protest is perhaps the more interesting protest is Rattigan's exposure of. Now you can see I've written the word dilemma. I don't think the word dilemma is strong enough. A dilemma is like, oh, it's a problem. Conflict implies people butting heads, and if I'm punching my knuckles to demonstrate it, it's his exposure of the conflict between the individual and the state. And now I've got the chance to demonstrate the different conflicts between the individual and the state. And we see that conflict through the way that Ronnie is perceived as a criminal, through his sister Catherine's desire to fight for him, to protect him. So let's read it all. While Rattigan evidently raises the issue of gendered roles in pre-World War I Edwardian society, perhaps the more interesting protest is Rattigan's exposure of the conflict between the individual and the state, seen through Ronnie's perception as a criminal, or I should maybe rephrase that as seen through Ronnie being perceived by many as a criminal, through his sister Catherine's desire to fight for him on a point of principle, and then how those conflicts begin to affect individuals and their relationships with others. You are told by me and by others of the importance to introduce debate. And debate does not necessarily mean introducing a provocative counterpoint that you struggle to justify. Debate really means, well, there's more than one element to this, so let's discuss more than one element. And that's what we're beginning to do. I'm acknowledging the idea of gendered roles, patriarchy perhaps, as well as this idea of the individual and the state. What many of these mock exams began to show was the need to ally this to the discussion of method. And this was made reference to in the previous lesson as well. And so what we want to do, given that the question asks about the ways that Rattigan does these things, we need to get that into the piece of writing fairly quickly. Now here, you'll notice I am using the word dilemma. I think that the word dilemma is more appropriate in this instance. Rattigan constructs two characters to embody this dilemma. John, who symbolises a belief in John, who symbolises a belief in the state being allowed to act as required, focusing on matters of importance. I'm going to put inverted commas around that one because I'm beginning to hint at what he says in the text. I need to justify some of this on occasion with some quotation. So where does John talk about the idea of importance? Here we are. There's a European war blowing up. There's a coal strike on. There's a fair chance of civil war. And there's 101 other things on the horizon at the moment that I think you could call genuinely important. Now you'll notice there that I just crossed out the quotation mark because I wanted to include the ellipsis to just indicate that there's more of the same on the way. And here I need to make reference to Catherine. And I'm using my semicolon to help kind of create this list. So John, who symbolises a belief in the state being allowed to act as required, focusing on matters of importance, such as there's a European war blowing up. And Catherine, who represents or who symbolises or who demonstrates an idea that she's representing, she's something more than herself, a belief in she argues for what's morally right. I'm introducing a kind of problem in some respects, because if her brother has indeed stolen the postal order, the 5 bob, well, then she's on sticky wicket, so to speak. It's a difficult case to argue, but it's the sense that it is implied that her brother is being made an example of, and that's what she sort of objects to. The full power of the state being used to crush one sort of reasonably innocent person. Is that the right thing to do? And now I probably just need to articulate that in the words. So there's a European war blowing up, and Catherine, who represents a belief in arguing for what is morally right, and again, I want to use a quotation to justify what I'm saying. The government should be there to aid people when they need it, even if they are a tiny individual, a small person. And if we go to this section here, and I'm looking through the text and making sure that I'm finding the piece of information, and your teachers can only do what you have to do in these scenarios, which is skim through the text themselves. At the bottom of the page, his innocence or guilt isn't important to me. They are to my father, not to me. I believe he didn't do it. I may be wrong. To prove that he didn't do it is of hardly more interest to me than the identity of the college servant, whoever it was. All I care about is that people should know that a government department has ignored a fundamental human right, and it should be forced to acknowledge it. That's all it matters. That's all that's important to me. If we then turn over the page, we can see how all I know is, John, if ever the time comes that the House of Commons has so much on its mind that it can't find the time to discuss a Ronnie Winslow and his bally postal order, this country will be a far poorer place than it is now. Now, initially, I thought I was going to use that first quotation because I think it demonstrates an interesting point, but it's not quite the point I was making. And therefore, that's why I paused, and that's why I looked again. And, I think there's a better quotation that I can use. And it's this one. The country would be a far poorer place if it doesn't discuss the Ronnie Winslows of this world. So I'm paraphrasing in part. I'm using only the bit of the quotation that helps me. And here I am discussing methods because the characters represent different things. So by giving it this big picture, well, John represents this, Catherine represents the kind of an opposing ideology. I am implicitly discussing method. After that, I can now begin to just reinforce what I've already said. So how do I go about doing that? Well, I need to recognize that this is an extract which has a kind of beginning and an end. And again, I'm implicitly discussing structure and therefore method if I do consider the beginning and the end. At the beginning of the extract, Catherine appears to be defiant in the face of John's argument. Her frequent interruptions and I'm just pausing here. It's already circled because that was highlighted in the lesson the other day. I think you should consider very carefully before you take the next step. The hyphen indicates an interruption. So at the beginning of the extract, Catherine appears to be defiant in the face of John's argument. Her frequent interruptions What does the hyphen indicate? I'm saying there that the hyphen indicates her impatience and the fervent belief in her argument. However, by the end of the extract, again, I'm using the writer's name just to demonstrate that I know that the writer is doing these things on purpose. However, by the end of the extract, Rattigan conveys Catherine to be somewhat cowed, almost to the point of defeat. And again, I can make reference to methods. How can we see this? Well, because she's quietly and steadily responding. But it's the quietly one that I need to use. So the stage directions are altered from speaking with some spirit to speaking quietly. Now, if I want to make my writing feel joined up and complete, I then need to make reference to what I said at the beginning. And at the beginning, I said that it raises the issue of gendered roles. And here I have another example of it. At the beginning, I said that we see how what occurs on a grand macro level begin, how big conflicts begin to affect individuals and their relationships with others. And here we have a perfect example of it. So my introduction seeks to lay out the argument that the rest of my essay reinforces all the way through it. So here, by the end of the extract, Rattigan conveys Catherine to be somewhat cowed, almost to the point of defeat, the stage directions having altered to speaking with some spirit to now speaking quietly. I want to be tentative, so I'm using the word perhaps. Perhaps this is evidence of a patriarchal society that gradually erodes as John does to Catherine. It gradually erodes the power of a female voice. I will add here as a caveat, even if he is so this is perhaps evidence of a patriarchal society that gradually erodes the power of a female voice, as John does to Catherine, even if he is reasonable in the way that he does it. and also how conflict on the macro level of the state can begin to impact the personal. Where do we see that? Well, in the last section, Catherine asks, do you want to marry me? John says, yes, I've never, have I ever wavered before? No, never. Well, I'm not wavering now. We can see there's conflict. And again, I can't assume that teacher, examiner, whoever knows what I mean. I have to write it down so that I demonstrate that I know what I mean. So, and also how conflicts on the macro level of the state can impact the personal. And there you are. Now, if I want to take this a step further, I now begin to allow my first part of my essay to direct where I go next. So, and it's now where I begin to let the text direct me. And I can afford to do that because my introduction has already outlined what my main line of argument is. And that's the thing that I'm always going to be returning to. So now as the text begins to direct me, well, I can just write about interesting things. John, in the last line of this extract, correcting himself. Why? What does it reveal? Then I can begin to ask questions like, why is John reasonable? Why does this matter? What is Rattigan's viewpoint? Then I can ask interesting questions like, why is Ronnie silent in the scene? Why is he asleep? Why are the other characters talking about him? Why in this particular scene is he not involved in the conversation? How would the conversation be different if he were involved in it? And so on. It really then just becomes a case of, well, you write about the interesting things that go on. I'm going to set a piece of work to follow this, which is approximately going to focus on having a go at it a further time and practicing, because when you look at it again, it's not an exercise in thinking about it. You've looked at it once, you're looking at it again a second time here, so your ideas should be more fully formed, and it becomes instead an exercise in practicing your writing. That's the thing to have a go at. That's it for now. I'll stop sharing the screen. I'll put a copy of the extract on the Google Classroom and Go for Schools. And then, as I say, it's a case of practicing that writing, because that's the thing that will determine how well it all goes in the end. That's it. Thanks very much. Bye for now.